The race could look like. You see all of those faces could be potential candidates. I spoke to 5 2020 senior campaign officials over the weekend, and the sense is that the general election isn't necessarily going to be the hard part. Each thinks that Donald Trump is actually very much beatable. The hard part, according to all of them, is differentiating their respected candidates from the rest of the giant Democratic field. Joining me now is Washington Post national political reporter Matt Viser and NBC and MSNBC senior political editor Beth Phoui. So again, differentiating yourself from the crowd. Matt, you were at Klobuchar. She stood in front of a bridge in Minnesota that she helped rebuild. She's been accused of playing small ball in the Senate, but she says that her small ball is actually getting things done. How did the crowd respond to her?
Yeah, I mean, she is so far in terms of differentiating herself, the only one to announce in a snowstorm. So she has that going for her, which is something. Like, we're talking about it, and the images from it are kind of remarkable. Watching her do that, I think her candidacy is interesting in the respect that it is different. That it's not as much about fighting; it's about bipartisanship. It's about working across the aisle. She's getting praise from some Senate Republicans who have worked with her, which is a different posture, as you point out, than Elizabeth Warren heading into the contest. Klobuchar is also going to Wisconsin, which is another interesting, not an early primary state, but an attempt to demonstrate that she is electable. She can win in these states that Democrats would need to pick off in order to win back the White House.
Matt, does she have enough name recognition, though? Do people know her? And if no, what is she doing to get to know people across the country?
Her name recognition is relatively low compared to others in the field, and so she's not registering as highly in the polls, which in this contest is kind of okay at this stage. I mean, it gives you an opportunity to come out and tell your story without much negative knowledge on the other hand. Elizabeth Warren is very well known, but her negatives are also high. So she has work to do in a different respect than Amy Klobuchar, which is to introduce herself and differentiate herself early on.
She has an opportunity to define herself, you could say. So in talking about the difference between the two candidates, Beth, you look at Klobuchar's website for her policies, and there really isn't much there. You go to Warren's website for her policies, and we'll put it up on the screen. It is chock full of everything that she wants to do. She wants to end Washington corruption, rebuild the middle class, strengthen our democracy, equal justice under law, a foreign policy for all. And each one of these things has actual details underneath it. She's been doing this for a long time, and she's been pretty consistent in her messaging. She's trying to portray herself as a fighter. How effective is that message? Has it been resonating with folks that are going out to see her?
Well, I think you asked the right question when we were getting into this segment about what are Democrats looking for in this large group of candidates who are running on the Democratic side. Do you want somebody who's going to sort of bring everybody together, heal, unify, or somebody who wants to punch Donald Trump in the face? And you have several candidates on the side of the kind of the unity side. You've got Amy Klobuchar, as Matt was describing. Cory Booker's taking that tack a bit. I was with Kamala Harris 2 weeks ago when she announced. She was very much talking about coming together, moving forward, healing, unifying. So, that's a promising message, perhaps, in the general election. I would argue that is not what Democratic primary voters necessarily want to hear. They really want to hear somebody who can take it to Trump, who can establish the differences between the two parties, who can talk about why Trump is the wrong choice for America, and present themselves as the one who can beat him decisively in November. That's a very big, that too is a risk, though, because you risk being seen as pugilistic, as too tough, as, Elizabeth Warren is seen, perhaps as, too much, lecturing. Bernie Sanders, who we expect to get in very shortly into this field, he's another one who's all about, handing it to the other side and being tough and being, potentially sort of negative. Voters want a little bit of both. They want people who are going to raise them up, but also people who are going to take their side, particularly in this primary.
I wonder what the lesson is from 2016 about that, because you could argue that Bernie Sanders was the fighter, the punch-you-in-the-face guy, in terms of policies, progressive policies, and really changing the status quo. And Hillary Clinton, although she was going toe-to-toe with Donald Trump aggressively, she was more of the moderate candidate, and she did not end up winning the Electoral College. Marcus Malitzis of the Daily Kos was on Meet the Press yesterday, and he said when it came to Klobuchar or Senator Bennett or someone like that, or Sherrod Brown, if Bennett does end up joining the race, compared to a Warren or a Sanders, he would rather have a yes we can candidate touting all of these progressive policies and pushing forward these big ideas, rather than a pragmatist candidate who is basically saying, no, we can't.
Well, the energy right now is certainly on the progressive side in the Democratic field in terms of issues, without question. You know, universal health care, many of them are talking about Medicare for all, a multi-millionaire tax, which of course Elizabeth Warren is talking about. These are things that used to be considered sort of fringe approaches to those issues that are now very much in the mainstream. And you've got people like Michael Bennett, who was on Meet the Press yesterday, and others who expressed concern that these are too left. And even though they might play very well in the Democratic primary, they're going to be very problematic for general election voters who may be tired of Donald Trump, certainly like many suburban, Republicans. They don't like Donald Trump very much, but they cannot stomach some of these more progressive approaches to issues.
Senator Klobuchar, will she end up moving more to the left as the race goes on? Wall Street Journal has already not necessarily endorsed her candidacy, but is touting her candidacy, the editorial board there, but they warn that if she is pulled to the left, she does, as Beth was saying, make herself potentially less electable to voters who don't want such a progressive. Matt?
Yeah, I mean, I do think that Amy Klobuchar faces an interesting challenge, right? I mean, she, on the one hand, has something different to offer from others in the field. A lot of the energy, as Beth was pointing out, is on the left. And Bernie Sanders certainly tugged the party in that direction, even though he lost in 2016. The party's talking about all of the issues that he was talking about, and in many cases, in the ways that he was talking about them. Klobuchar is not doing that, at least so far, and that is somewhat the test of her candidacy is how big the marketplace is in the current Democratic environment for a little bit more moderate positions, for the idea that I will work with Republicans on incremental change, or do we want fundamental big shifting change like the type that Elizabeth Warren talks about?
It is important to remember that there was actually a lot of crossover between Bernie Sanders voters and Donald Trump voters in 2016. There were a lot of those folks out there who really liked the progressive policies that Sanders was putting forth and the more protectionist policies that he was advocating that lined up with Donald Trump. So maybe there is some middle ground there as well. Matt Visor, Beth Phouie, guys, thank you very much. And Virginia Governor Ralph Northam sat down for an interview with CBS this weekend to apologize for wearing blackface in the 1980s. But during the interview, Northam appeared to undersell the very notion of American slavery, calling the practice indentured servitude.
Just 90 miles from here, in 1619, the first indentured servants from Africa landed on our shores in Old Point Comfort, what we call now Fort Monroe. And while
also known as slavery.
Indentured servitude, where people worked off a debt or the cost of travel, was common in colonial America, but it is not interchangeable with forced enslavement. Joining me now is the president of the National Black Farmers Association, John Boyd Jr. He met with Governor Northam last week. Professor of Africana Studies at Princeton University and MSNBC contributor Eddie Glaude and NBC News correspondent Jeff Bennett. John, it's good to have you back. You told us that after your appearance with us the other week when you were talking about your soybean farm and the shutdown and how it was affecting you, that Governor Northam's office reached out to you directly. This was before this controversy erupted. What did they say to you?
Well, basically, we met during that first meeting after you watched the segment here. And after the issue came up with blackface, the governor reached back out and asked would I come in and talk to him about it. And we prayed together. I prayed for his family. I prayed for Virginia. I prayed for this country to come together at this very troubling time in history. And we had a very candid conversation about race in this country, about blackface. And I suggested to the governor that we really need to bring this country together. And in that meeting, the governor asked for forgiveness, and he looked me in the eye and asked me to forgive him. And I did. Based on that conversation, I urged the governor in that meeting to go out and let the Virginians know that he still wanted to lead the state of Virginia. I think that they needed to hear from him at that time, and he'd done that later that afternoon. So I would say it was a very productive meeting, and I know a lot of people may have trouble with that decision, but I believe in the power of redemption and forgiveness. And who are we to judge? You know, let he who cast the first stone be without sin. That's no man, woman, boy, or child. So based on that meeting, I forgave the governor and hope that many other people will forgive him as well. There's a poll out in the Washington Post out there, was an interview there that basically said Virginians were split 47-47. But amongst African Americans, it's about 58% for him to remain in his position.
We have that poll. We'll put that up on the screen. You're right. 58% of African Americans in Virginia think Northam should not step down. Two other questions for you,
Right.
John. I saw an interview
Yes.
you did with the local ABC station there where you said it's better to have Northam in power, and I'm paraphrasing here, than potentially get a Republican in charge who might not be advocating the same policies for minorities and African Americans that Northam has pledged to do. What do you make of Northam talking to Gayle King of CBS over the weekend and calling slavery indentured servitude? He's released a statement saying he's still learning and he's got a lot more learning to do. With all due respect to the governor, he is the governor of a formerly Confederate state. Don't you think he would have known these basic facts by now? Does it concern you that he does not? Should it concern you?
Well, he told me in a meeting that when we spoke about race, he told me in the meeting that he said, John, I have a lot to learn on this issue, and he wants to learn. He wanted to reach out to more African-American leaders. And, you know, we're celebrating 400 years when, you know, slaves first came to the coast of the state of Virginia. We're celebrating 400 years of that. And during those beginning time periods, someone calls indentured servants and some were called slaves. The slave laws came actually later in the state of Virginia, so and the colonial time period there. So technically he's right on one hand and technically he's wrong on the other, but you know, people can look at that and continue to judge the governor, but he came out and asked for forgiveness, and I believe that it's time in this country to bring this country together. We're so far apart here on race, you know, with the president making, I believe, racist comments just about every day. And nobody's asking to impeach him or anything like that. There's nothing pending in the House or Senate to impeach this president. We have modern-day racists like Steve King, who makes those type of statements right now. So we have the governor on one hand asking for forgiveness and his door open, and I've been right here on your show asking for a meeting with the president to discuss why African-American farmers can't get their checks from the government. I've been on this very show asking for a meeting with the Agriculture Secretary. All those meetings fell upon deaf ears, and this governor is reaching out to me to get my advice on race relations in the state of Virginia. There's a big difference there.
Point well taken there. I will just make one small note. There have been congressmen who have and women who have been introduced articles of impeachment against the president in the House, and they've been talking about impeachment. But you're right to say that there is not a formal impeachment proceeding underway.
Yes.
Jeff Bennett, the other part of this, the other thing that complicates what's going on in Virginia is what's happening with the Lieutenant Governor, Justin Fairfax. He's been accused now of 2 women of sexual abuse. Explain what's going on with him.
So the lieutenant governor, Katie, says he's not resigning, in part because he says he has nothing to resign for, even as Dr. Vanessa Tyson and Meredith Watson allege 2 encounters with him that they characterize as sexual assault. He says those same encounters were 100% consensual. Now, Lieutenant Governor's back on the job today. He's presiding over the business of the Senate, and on his way into the Capitol, I caught up with him just briefly. Here's a bit of that interaction.
Is there anything you want to say to the people of Virginia, sir? We have called. Finish your sentence, please, sir. Excuse me. I said we have called for an independent investigation, and I am still very confident in the truth. Thank you all so much.
So he's calling for an independent investigation. Over the weekend, he put out a press release saying that he wanted the FBI to look into this. Our Pete Williams is reporting via a law enforcement source that the FBI is not going to look into these allegations, in part because it doesn't have the jurisdiction to do so. One way to get an investigation into these allegations would actually be an impeachment hearing. There'd be a public hearing. The two women accusers who now say they would participate in such a thing would come forward and share their stories publicly. But here at the Capitol, you have Democrats who say that that kind of thing would gum up the work of the legislature, that they have to end their session by the end of the month. But also they make the point that Lieutenant Governor Fairfax would not have a fair hearing. Was getting lost in all of this. He's the guy who said he wore blackface to impersonate a rapper he liked to listen to at the time. He's not going anywhere either. So you have this storm of scandals, but so far all of these officials are staying put, Katie.
It is a storm of scandal, indeed. That's good. That's a good way to describe it. Eddie Glaude, wrap it up for us. What do we make of this, and how much should we factor in the poll that John Boyd brought up, which is that most Virginia African Americans, at least according to this poll, say that Governor Northam should not step down?
I think we probably would have to drill down in terms of the question that was asked and how it was answered, Katie, that you might have a large number of respondents expressing their concern about a Republican becoming the governor of the state of Virginia, and that would actually mitigate how they're responding to the question about Northam's future. I want to say two things really quickly. One is that, you know, these folks are public servants, and public servants ought to be held to a higher standard, in my view. They're not guaranteed the position if they can no longer govern in the state of Virginia, if they can no longer push forward an agenda that will benefit the least of these and the most vulnerable in the state of Virginia. They should step down. They should resign. They are not guaranteed these positions simply because they were elected. They were elected to do the people's work. If they can no longer do the people's work, then they need to step aside and allow folks to do it. I want to make one quick historical point with regards to Governor Northam's point in conversation with Gayle King on CBS. It's important to know, Katie, that slavery evolved. John Boyd mentioned this. Slavery evolved in the United States. In the context of Jamestown, this is what the late historian Ira Berlin called the charter generation. This is a society with slaves, not a slave society. So it's much more fluid. You had a mixture of indentured servants and slaves. And so it's important to kind of say that if we're going to hold Governor Northam to account, that's not really the mistake to hold him for. He kind of muffed it a bit. He wasn't as nuanced as he should have been, but he alluded to the fact that racial slavery, the kind of slavery that we are constantly referencing, we're really referencing the antebellum period, which comes much later. So at the end of the day, we're still a deeply racist country. We got a lot of work to do, and Virginia's a mess.
Well, if you're going to talk about the history of slavery, I think you got to take someone from someone like Eddie Glaude from Princeton, who is the professor of Africana Studies. Eddie Glaude, thank you so much. John,
can I make one point here?
Yeah, we have almost no time, so go ahead.
Yes, basically the piece about impeachment with the lieutenant governor.
Rồi gợi Clear Botanic mới giúp sạch thoáng da đầu, ngăn gầu quay lại.
Fox News alert: more questions for Democrats over the path forward amid a crisis of leadership in Virginia. Governor Ralph Northam and Attorney General Mark Herring refusing to resign over.
I think you're very right to bring up those allegations as well. They've been brought up a lot, and you're correct to say the president hasn't faced any real consequence for those allegations. He's denied all of them, I should say, and again, some articles of impeachment have been brought up in the House, but they haven't been moved on. Jeff Bennett, John Boyd Jr., and Eddie Glaude, thank you guys very much. And a lot of talk today about who leaked the text messages, the Jeff Bezos text messages to the National Enquirer. But let's not lose sight of what could be the more significant part of this story, which is what does that leak and that threat that followed the leak mean for the tabloid's non-prosecution agreement with the Southern District of New York? Joining me is Daily Beast White House reporter Asawin Subsang and the editor-in-chief of Lawfare and senior fellow at Brookings Institution, Benjamin Wittes. He's also an MSNBC analyst. Okay, Ben, I want to talk to you about this non-prosecution agreement. Here's what it is. We'll put it up on the screen. It's understood that AMI shall truthfully and completely disclose all information with respect to the activities of itself and its officers. Remember, this is surrounding Michael Cohen and payment to women, hush money to women during the 2016 election. Number 2, shall commit no crimes whatsoever. Number 3, it's understood that should AMI commit any crime subsequent to the data of signing of this agreement, or should the government determine that AMI or its representatives have knowingly given false, incomplete, or misleading testimony or information, or should AMI otherwise violate any provision of this agreement, AMI shall therefore be subject to prosecution for any federal criminal violation of which this office has knowledge, shall be admissible in evidence in any criminal proceeding brought against AMI. That's one big paragraph, not multiple points, as I incorrectly pointed out. Ben, what is it going to mean for the non-prosecution agreement? I'm looking specifically at shall commit no crimes whatsoever.
Right. So when Jeff Bezos stands up and says, hey, I've been subject to blackmail and extortion, that obviously raises a question about whether the entity that he's accusing of engaging in that activity with respect to him is committing a crime. Now, you know, analysts disagree about how plausible it is that AMI could actually be subject to prosecution here. And I think it's probably an unlikely criminal case. That's just my gut instinct. But if you have an agreement that doesn't require that you be charged with the crime, it simply requires that the government regard you as not having committed a crime, it does put a lot of power in the hands of the Southern District of New York to say, hey, you guys have not been in compliance with your agreement. We're not necessarily going to charge you with that, but we are going to regard the agreement as not in force. And so I think it's a potentially dangerous situation for AMI. And certainly if, you know, if you were somebody's lawyer and they said, hey, I just signed this agreement with the prosecutors, do you think I should send this correspondence to the richest man in the world? Any lawyer, good lawyer, would have told you that would be exceedingly ill-advised.
Also, when this is being compared to another case where a billionaire went up against a media company. That was Peter Thiel versus Gawker. And Peter Thiel won that, and Gawker went out of business. Scott Galloway, who is a professor at NYU of marketing, was quoted in Maureen Dowd's opinion piece from over the weekend saying that AMI went out of business this week. They just don't know it. They have a megalodon after them. Could this spell the end of the National Enquirer?
I mean, if Jeff Bezos takes this to court and really does want to legally take it all the way with his armada of lawyers, I mean, anything's possible. It would certainly be incredibly uncomfortable for people who work at AMI, the National Enquirer, and David Pecker himself, who has long been a media and political ally of President Donald Trump. Now, it has not gotten to that point yet. I don't think any indication has been thrown out yet at this point that Bezos wants to do what Peter Thiel and Hulk Hogan did to Gawker. And there are, of course, major distinctions between both of these situations and the circumstances. Like Gawker, whatever people want to say, either negative or positive about them, I don't think they were ever accused of running essentially a quote-unquote blackmail operation as a major part of their journalistic ethical or unethical institution, whereas whereas something like AI and the Enquirer, we've interviewed former private investigators who have worked for the Enquirer, and they have all used the word blackmail to describe what they did.
And it's not just Jeff Bezos who's come out and accused them of this. After he did that, the Associated Press talked about tactics that the National Enquirer tried to use against its reporters. Ronan Farrow talked about tactics that the National Enquirer used. A number of other celebrities have come out and accused the National Enquirer of unseemly tactics as well. There's a broad spectrum of people and organizations that the National Enquirer has gone against. Oswin Subsang and Benjamin Wittes, we are going to keep an eye on the story, see where it goes. Thanks so much, guys. And my next guest has an idea for what billionaires can do to solve income inequality: get taxed instead of just giving to charity. Highlights a disturbing trend in global income inequality. The top 26 wealthiest people in the world own as much as the 3.8 billion poorest people on Earth. You heard that right. In other words, a minute fraction, so minute we can't even give you the number, of the world's population owns the same amount as the bottom 49%. When confronted with this problem, the very wealthy often promote a solution of their own, and that is charity. The richest people and companies in the world donate billions to philanthropic organizations. But in a viral video published late last month, my next guest argues that is not enough to address global inequality.
I hear people talk in the language of participation and justice and equality and transparency. But then, I mean, almost no one raises the real issue of tax avoidance, right? And of the rich just not paying their fair share. I mean, it feels like I'm at a firefighters conference and no one's allowed to speak about water. We got to be talking about taxes. Yeah, that's it. Taxes, taxes, taxes. All the rest is in my opinion.
Joining me now, historian and author of the book Utopia for Realists, Rutger Bregman. Rutger, thanks so much for being with us. I know it's late where you are. You said this at Davos, which is full of billionaires who show up and corporations. What is the point you were trying to make? Explain it a little bit more for us, that there needs to be taxation, not just billionaires handing out money to charities.
Okay, so you got to imagine Davos, the World Economic Forum, is the place where the richest of the richest come every year, right? And they debate all kinds of issues that at first sight, they seem quite progressive, right? They talk about climate change and about feminism, about the need for inclusion. There was Sir David Attenborough, who had a new film about climate change, and I literally saw people crying in the room. And then there's like people coming in 1,500 private jets to attend this conference. And no one's allowed to the issue taxes and tax avoidance. So that's what I tried to do. And well, I guess they weren't very happy with me about that.
So talk to me about why taxes are so necessary, why it's not just enough to donate millions of dollars to charity.
Okay, so what historians always find out is that we have this period in history in the 50s and the 60s, which we call the golden age of capitalism, when we had the highest growth rates, the most innovation. And this was actually also the period when we had much higher taxes on the wealthy, when they really paid their pay. So under the Republican President Eisenhower, for example, the top marginal tax rate in the US was 91%. Now, people don't know this, but progressive taxation is really an American invention. And I think we just need to go back to those same policies and make sure that, you know, work actually pays and rent-seeking doesn't.
Do charities pay for infrastructure, roads, bridges, schools, in mass?
Not really. You know, don't get me wrong, I'm not against charity. I mean, come on, tell me all about your wonderful plans. But when charity is being used as a way to distract people from what's really going on, you know, the massive tax avoidance and also, you know, frankly, just corrupt business models where people are just exploiting their workers, not paying them a living wage, then we should be very careful around philanthropy. And often, if you look at, you know, the fortunes of these billionaires, it's just a very small fraction that they're actually giving.
Nobody is insulting the charity that they're giving out, but there are real questions about whether or not you can still give the charity and pay more in taxes to fix, I don't know, things like infrastructure.
You know, pay your taxes first and then tell me all about your wonderful plans to give to charity.
Pay your taxes and instead of buying the yacht, send that money to charity. I don't know.
Exactly.
Rutger Bregman. Rutger, thank you so much for joining us. We appreciate it. Good luck out there. Good luck in the next Davos. I don't know if you'll be invited back. Hopefully you will, though. We will be right back, though. Stay with us. That will wrap things up for me this hour. Ali Velshi is here. Ali, one more thing for you. I just want it to be known. I know people haven't been talking about this, but I want to be the first to say it. And you know, you shoot me if you got it. But Miley Cyrus killed it last night with Dolly Parton.
I somehow thought the reason we were ending your show a little early because you wanted to continue listening to the Miley Cyrus that you were listening to in the commercial break.
Miley Cyrus. I love it.
There's a whole new show to be the stuff that happens when we're not on camera.
I love Fish and I love Miley Cyrus.
I walked in here to Miley Cyrus wondering where this was going. You have a great afternoon. Congratulations to you, Miley.
See you at 5 o'clock, everyone.
Very good. All right. All right, we must use this moment to move forward. That is the message from House Speaker Nancy Pelosi this afternoon. Speaker Pelosi and other Democratic leaders condemned controversial tweets by freshman Democratic Congresswoman Ilhan Omar about the pro-Israel lobby in the United States. Congressman Omar first tweeted Sunday night that money was driving U.S. politicians to defend Israel. She tweeted a song lyric saying, "It's all about the Benjamins, baby." She then tweeted that AIPAC, the American Israeli Public Affairs Committee, was paying politicians to support Israel. Moments ago, Congresswoman Omar just tweeted, listening and learning, standing strong. Joining me now with more on that is NBC's Capitol Hill correspondent Casey Hunt, host of MSNBC's KCDC. Casey, this thing unrolled with some great speed in the last 24 hours.
That's right, Ali. It really has. We went from these tweets last night to condemnations very quickly from some Republican leaders in particular, but that was swiftly followed by condemnation from within Congresswoman Omar's own caucus, including from Jerry Nadler, the chairman of the Judiciary Committee, and then from the entirety of the Democratic leadership, as you pointed out. So here's what Ilhan Omar just released a couple of minutes ago. She says, quote, "Anti-Semitism is real, and I'm grateful for Jewish allies and colleagues who are educating me on the painful history of anti-Semitic tropes. My intention is never to offend my constituents or Jewish Americans as a whole. We have to always be willing to step back and think through criticism, just as I expect people to hear me when others attack me for my identity, and this is why I unequivocally apologize. At the same time, I reaffirm the problematic role of lobbyists in our politics, whether it be AIPAC, the NRA, or the fossil fuel industry. It's gone on too long. We must be willing to address it." Obviously, this controversy not about those other lobbies, but rather specifically about the way in which she framed this. Jerry Nadler referred to this as a deeply disappointing use of tropes that refer to Jewish people and money. You could really tell there was a groundswell against this throughout the course of the day, Ali.
All right. Do you have a sense of this apology? Because at the bottom of it, she does say, as you just read, I reaffirm the problematic role of lobbyists in our politics, whether it be AIPAC, the NRA, or the fossil fuel industry. It's gone on too long. We must be willing to address that. I would assume, after speaking to Nancy Pelosi and everybody with whom she's spoken, that she has issued an apology that's going to end it at that for her. But she does stipulate that AIPAC she considers to be a lobbying group. Is that going to cause her problems?
I think the fact that she says I unequivocally apologize works in her favor in terms of putting this to rest. I have already seen some comments, though. You know, Ali, I try to be careful how much weight I give to an immediate reaction that you hear on Twitter. Sometimes it's something real that sticks, and sometimes it isn't. But I have seen some people criticizing her for including these other groups in here, saying that she should have just focused strictly on this question of anti-Semitism. So we'll see. I mean, we should note that this isn't the first time that Ilhan Omar has been criticized for remarks that were perceived as anti-Semitic. She also tweeted back in 2012 that Israel had hypnotized the world. She later did acknowledge that she had used unfortunate words in that description, but obviously this has continued to be an issue for her since then. Alex.
Casey, thank you so much for this reporting. Casey Hunt on Capitol Hill for us. Stay close, because I'm going to have to come back to you in a few minutes, because we need to talk about the shutdown that is looming.
Indeed, we do.
I'll see you in a few minutes. Thank you, Casey. 2020 is already shaping up to be a record-shattering year as more women than ever have jumped into the race for White House. Just this weekend, Senators Elizabeth Warren and Amy Klobuchar made their official announcements. While the Democratic Party looks more diverse than ever, we are seeing very different approaches with these contenders as they prepare to take on President Trump. Moments ago, Senator Klobuchar released this campaign video in which she appears to take aim at both parties in Congress and calls for unity. All right, this leads to our big question. Which road will Democrats take to victory in 2020? Will Democrats choose a moderate from the Midwest like Klobuchar, a fiery progressive like Senator Warren? One key trait that we know Democrats are zeroing in on is viability. According to this Monmouth polling, 56% of registered Democrats or Democrat-leaning independents would prefer a candidate that will be stronger against President Trump, even if they don't exactly align with that candidate on the issues. Compare that to just 33% who prefer a candidate with whom they agree on all the issues, even if that person will have a hard time beating Trump. This is something important to discuss. Joining me now, senior advisor at MoveOn.org and MSNBC contributor Karine Jean-Pierre. And with us is Matt Bennett, senior vice president of public affairs and co-founder of Third Way. He served in the Clinton White House as a deputy assistant to the president. Thanks to both of you for being here. And I don't really want to create false arguments where there aren't, because I think people can hold both thoughts in their mind, right? That they want somebody, Karine, with whom they agree. At the same time, it is a priority for Democrats to defeat Donald Trump. It's a priority for some Republicans to not see Donald Trump as president. But how do you address this particular issue? Because there is division amongst people who consider themselves Democrats.
Right, and I think it's exactly how you just started out. I think it's a little bit of both. And we saw that. We actually have data. We saw that in 2018 on November 6th when Democrats took back the House and also won in some upper Midwestern states. Were able to take back some state legislatures, some chambers, and that was incredibly impressive. And that was because of the energy that was out there. There was a very energized Democratic base, but a lot of it was because of bold new ideas, and also they wanted, at least in the House and Congress, they wanted to make sure there was a check on Donald Trump. So I think it's both. This is one poll, but we actually have data that shows what voters want, and we saw that in November 2018.
In fact, let's take a look. You were talking about polling. I want to show you a little bit more. Men versus women among Democrats who are willing to put policy propositions aside to nominate someone who could beat Trump. Women in this latest poll show a lead over men. 61% of women polled say, I'll put my policy positions aside to beat Trump. More men wanted to not put their policy aside. But let's take a look at another graph which shows Democrats identifying as liberal. And you're seeing that blue line, that's the liberal line. You're seeing that Democratic political ideology is skewing liberal. There are a number of polls that indicate this. Matt, we've spoken to some conservatives who are saying, hey, if you guys nominate a moderate, you have more chance of getting moderate voters, including some Republicans who are fed up with Donald Trump. Is that a viable way for Democrats to be thinking about this?
Well, I want to be clear that I don't want to take advice from Republicans about who Democrats.
Well, that's what I hear a lot of. Right, I hear a lot of that. But to the extent that there are, to the extent that they are looking in some cases to vote for somebody who's not Donald Trump, is that worth considering?
Well, sure. And I think to Karine's point about the midterms, if you look at what happened in 2018, 23 million people voted in the Democratic primaries. And in some states, Republicans or independents can also vote in those primaries. That's going to be true in 2020 as well. The people that they chose were the people that they thought had the best chance of beating the Republicans, because last year it was their first chance to put a check on Trump, and they did that in spades. We had a net pickup of 40 Democratic seats in the House. 33 of those 40 were endorsed by the moderate New Democrat PAC, because I think people just had this instinct that that was going to be who played a little bit better. And you saw that in the governor's races in places like Michigan and Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, states that if Democrats can win again, they're almost certain to beat Trump in 2020.
So, Karine, that's interesting. Let's talk about health care as a perfect example, right? Kind of everybody believes we need a better health care system than the one we have now. A number of Democratic candidates have endorsed Medicare for all. It there are a lot of Americans. Kaiser polling indicates that most Americans just want an improvement over what we have now. So how do you play that? Because it was the #1 issue for Democrats in the last election, but it wasn't about Medicare for all. It was about Republicans trying to repeal Obamacare.
Right, it was that as well. But many candidates actually ran on Medicare for all. And we have to remember, that we have to work out the details, and there are devils in the details, absolutely, which we're finding out, and we're working through that. But when you put it out there, Medicare for all, there are independents, there are Republicans, and Democrats who want that. And that's just a fact, and you see that in poll after poll after poll. But I do want to say that I want to say this, that there's always this conversation of dividing the Democratic Party. And even if you look at the 2020ers, they are, most of them agree on taxing the uber wealthy. A lot of them agree with that. Most of them agree on the Green New Deal. And most of them agree on some form of single payer. So there are more that puts us together that divide us. Yes, we're moving much more far to progressive, but it's not just about progressive, it's about the issues. People want to be able to put food on their table, pay their rents. They don't want to be living under the poverty line. And so what you're seeing is more folks talking about it and being really open about it, talking about income inequality, and all of those things are important.
So to the extent, Matt, that some of these issues that we talk about, I mean, look, I come from Canada. A good minimum wage and health care for all isn't actually a progressive policy in Canada. It's everybody shares that view. But to the extent that, as Karine says, so many of these candidates do seem to share views on a number of these issues, it almost feels like the moderate candidates can stand out more because folks are crowding out on the left.
Well, I think there's a little of that. Remember that in Democratic primaries, there tends to be not a ton of daylight between candidates on policy points. I think there will be some. Medicare for all is different than Medicare for some, and really only Senator Sanders and maybe Senator Harris have endorsed the kind of full-on single payer. Others are about Medicare buy-in, so there's some differences. But I think the big difference that may end up being decisive for voters next year is, do they want a candidate who is focused on kind of an aspirational, optimistic view of the future, or are they focused, or would they like somebody who is kind of classify themselves as a fighter and is more angry? And you could make a rational argument for either way, but that may be more decisive than the policy difference.
So that's an interesting distinction, fighter versus aspirational. How do you think about that?
I actually think it's all of it. You can walk and chew gum at the same time. I think you can be inspirational and you can show that you have the fight, and you could put forth some really strong issues. That's going to be the key for all of these candidates, regardless if we get a dozen or 20. I'm not sure. We're still waiting. But they have to show all of that, because the base does want to be inspired, and as we saw in 2020, they want to hear about the issues, and they want to see if we can beat Trump. Are you the candidate there that can win in 2020?
But that's a question candidates have to almost ask themselves, right?
Right, before they run, yeah.
Most of the candidates, nobody questions their competence.
Right.
Most people think they can be good candidates, they can be good presidents. The question is, what can I offer that someone else can offer better?
Right, and I think that's exactly right, and that's what you're seeing in Klobuchar's announcement, and Warren, and Kamala Harris, and Cory Booker. But I do have to say this. I think that in order to beat Trump, we have to be bold, and we have to be put forth really strong issues. We can't get in the mud with him. Yes, we have to show that we can fight, but we can't just dive in there in the mud, because we can't play on the Republicans' turf, because that hurts us.
Thank you to both of you for a very good conversation. Karine Jean-Pierre, Senior Advisor at MoveOn.org. Matt Bennett is the co-founder of the Democratic think tank Third Way. Now, in just a few hours, we're going to see dueling rallies in El Paso, Texas. President Trump is holding a rally just blocks away from an event including former Congressman Beto O'Rourke, someone who is mulling a 2020 run. Joining me now is Texas's own MSNBC's Garrett Haake in El Paso, who is very familiar with the Beto campaign. Garrett, what's going on down there?
Well, Ali, I just walked out of a news conference here, not attended by Beto O'Rourke, but by the congresswoman who replaced him, Veronica Escobar, and essentially all of the elected officials here in El Paso County, in which they all roundly condemned the way that the president has been talking about their community. They said his comments about El Paso having been a dangerous city are untrue. His comments about a wall that was built here in 2008, cutting crime here, are untrue, and that they're worried he's going to fly into El Paso again tonight and continue to lie about their city. They are so worried, in fact, that the county commissioners and the county judge, which is like a county executive here, passed this resolution today in which they say they are disillusioned by President Trump's lies regarding the border and our committee. I have not seen such an unwelcoming committee for the president and one of his rallies in a very long time. It goes to show you how upset people in this community were about the president's mention of El Paso in his State of the Union speech last week, and how strong the pushback here is going to be from this Beto O'Rourke-led rally tonight, which could draw thousands of people, to the current elected officials really pushing back hard. And I asked Veronica Escobar about that in her press conference just now. Here's what she said.
This is his opportunity to truly see the community. And frankly, it's his opportunity to see the consequences of policies that his administration put in place that many of us have deemed cruel, ineffective, incompetent, and anti-American.
What do you want the president to take away from his visit to El Paso?
That his lies will not go unchallenged.
You're going to hear a lot of that kind of language from O'Rourke tonight and from the other speakers at this counter-protest. Ali, when you think about it, with the shutdown debate about the border wall, this will really be the center of the political universe around 9 o'clock tonight when the president speaks in the El Paso Coliseum. And really just about half a block away, O'Rourke leads this counter-rally that'll walk essentially in the shadow of the fence that exists here down to a park across the street. It will really just be ground zero for this whole debate right here in El Paso, Texas tonight.
Garrett, thank you. Garrett Haake for us in El Paso. We'll, of course, be staying close to this story for the rest of the day. California Governor Gavin Newsom will be pulling back all members of the National Guard who've been deployed to the Mexico border, saying the state will not be part of President Trump's, quote, manufactured crisis. The 360 troops will be redeployed to fight wildfires, to help with the state's drug task force and gather intelligence on drug cartels. Last April, President Trump authorized the deployment of up to 4,000 National Guard troops in Texas, Arizona, New Mexico, and California. Last week, New Mexico withdrew its troops. After California removes its 360, 1,145 troops will remain in Texas, 580 in Arizona. All right, coming up, a new clue about the possible connection between Russia and the Trump campaign. After the break, we're going to explain how comments from one of Special Counsel Robert Mueller's lead prosecutors might hint at what's at the heart of the Russia investigation. You're watching MSNBC.